Uh, Thank you for joining us and attending our Deal 9 info session. We are thrilled to have you here. We're going to jump right in. This info session will be recorded, so you will have an opportunity. It will be shared. There'll be links on our website, so you can also look at our YouTube channel. If you want to revisit this recording at any time, you will have an opportunity to do so, particularly as you are starting your application process. And feel free to share this recording with other folks who you think may also be interested in learning more about the fellowship and particularly the application process. Before we go any further, I want to, if you cannot hear me or are having any audio or technical challenges, please type something in the chat or you can let us know and we can make sure that you can hear correctly. All right. So we are going to begin with our land and ancestor acknowledgement. Um, and I will, oh, I'm sorry, you all. So I'm going to start by reading this. This is the land and ancestor acknowledgement that we have borrowed from Healing by Choice Detroit. And this acknowledgement is the same acknowledgement that we utilize at the start of our fellowship sessions. We begin by acknowledging and uplifting the history and present of Detroit as Anishinaabe, the people of the three fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Detroit is the largest majority Black city in the nation with a long legacy of African diasporic global contributions, which was once the last stop on the Underground Railroad. Known by its code name Midnight, Detroit is also neighbor to the U.S. city with the largest concentration of Arab Americans, a border city with historic and growing Latinx communities, and a legacy of Asian American communities and movements. We acknowledge this land, its history, and all the beings seen and unseen, known and unknown, as we step into our work on this land, most of us as uninvited guests. We offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this land. And again, this land and ancestor acknowledgement was borrowed from Healing by Choice Detroit. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with introducing the DEAL team so you know who we are. We will also talk a little bit about the history of DEAL and the Damon J. Keefe Center, which DEAL is an initiative of. We will talk about the DEAL program. What is DEAL? What about the fellowship experience, the curriculum? We will transition then to our racial equity definition. There, the word racial, the term racial equity, as you all may know, has been elevated a lot over the past several years. And we felt it was important for us to have our own definition so that it is clear when we say racial equity, what do we mean? Again, we'll talk about the fellowship. And that will include expectations, like what are the expectations of fellows? We'll talk about who leads the fellowship and we'll answer some questions that are frequently asked, but there'll also be time for you all to ask us any questions if we did not cover information that you want. And we'll talk about the application process. So when the application closes and what happens after that, so you are aware of what's next, the next steps. I'm going to start with introducing myself, and then I'll introduce the folks who are not present for this info session. And then I'll start with transition to Peter, Aisha, and Namira and ask them to introduce themselves. My name is Asandi Connor. This is me right here. I am the director of the Detroit Equity Action Lab. Not with us today and on maternity leave is Brianna Chester Bay, our fellowship program manager, who is also an alum of the Deal 3 cohort. Also not with us is Sharnice Tate. She is our planning coordinator. She is new permanent to our team and works very closely with Rihanna on the logistics for fellowship sessions as well as all deal events. And then finally, Shane Bernardo, who is a part of our deal design team. And the design team are alumni who help us co-facilitate the deal fellowship sessions. So Shane is a design team fellowship facilitator. He also is an alum of the Deal 2 cohort. Peter, I'll kick it off to you to introduce yourself, then Aisha and Namira.
Great. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. My name's Peter Hammer. I teach at Wayne State Law School. I direct the Damon J. Keith Center of Civil Rights, and shortly I'll be talking a little bit about the history of the DEAL program.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aisha Jamali. I work with Deal as the communications and marketing specialist.
Peace, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Namira Slamanani. I'm a Deal 3 alum and then also part of the design team.
Thank you. All right, Peter, you can talk about the history and origin. That would be great.
Yeah, so the first thing to sort of start is just thinking about the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. And then sort of tagline, I've always said that at the center, we really view spatial structural racism as our generation's primary civil rights challenge. And a lot of our programming is designed around that. And as you learn more about the DEAL, you'll see how the DEAL is an essential part of our leadership development in order to help sort of recruit, nurture the folks who are out there on the front line fighting for racial equity. Uh, it's also part of a larger sort of vision of the Keith Center. I often talk about sort of the knowledge component, the network component, and the narrative. Knowledge is sort of getting the deeper analytic understanding of the way that spatial structural racism functions. The narrative is acknowledgement how belief systems and the dominant stories really dictate institutions. So you have to do the narrative work as in addition to kind of the institutional and the policy work. And then the network is really the DEAL program. We view this as a decentralized network for social change. We acknowledge that there's already people doing wonderful work on racial equity, but if we can come together and have a more aligned understanding of the problems and build and deepen our relationships, we're all going to be much more effective in what we're doing. But again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. So if you're not familiar, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with DEAL at all, we know that at least one person joining us today knows some of the fellows that either current fellows or alumni fellows of our program. So we just want to kind of level set for you. What is DEAL? What do we do? And our mission is to develop leaders who work to end structural racism in Detroit. We are very clear and very specific about that. And the way that we go about doing that is we talk about DEAL as a racial equity leadership development program, and we are co-creating a multiracial and multi-generational network of racial equity leaders. Our role is to equip the leaders with tools to disrupt racism and not just disrupt it for the sake of disruption, but to create equitable alternatives together. So they are not working in silos, they are working as a network, as you heard Peter mention, who are sometimes collaborating outside of the fellowship as individuals or across their organizations to work to disrupt and dismantle structural racism in Detroit in various ways. And we acknowledge that that can look different in many ways. We will talk a little bit later when we talk about the application about what we mean about racial equity leadership, because we've learned that that question has come up and that sometimes folks are not clear about what we mean when we talk about racial equity leadership. But this is our mission. Again, working to end equipping leaders and working with leaders and pouring into them to end structural racism in Detroit. I'm going to have Aisha talk about our racial equity definition, which is, I would say, very special to us as a staff. And she'll talk about our journey there and a little bit more about what this definition means.
So this is how we have decided to define racial equity. Racial equity centers the humanity and dignity of all people, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It begins with acknowledging those historically and systemically harmed by a racial hierarchy that perpetuates white supremacy and anti-Blackness. It demands that our communities have the power to replace racist policies, institutions, and culture with a collective commitment toward co-liberation. Could you go to the next slide? So I wanted to break down a little bit what we decided to include in our racial equity definition. So as you see in the beginning, we're really starting off by naming our values, right? So like centering the humanity and dignity of all people, especially BIPOC people. And then we talk about what is the problem that we're seeing when it comes to racial equity, right? There's people that are being systemically harmed by a racial hierarchy. What does that racial hierarchy do? It's the racial hierarchy that's perpetuating white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So specifically naming the problem, which is really important. And then we go into talking about what we see as the solution to that problem, right? So making space for our communities to have that power. Sandy talked about, our fellowship program supporting and equipping leaders with the tools to disrupt racism and create equitable alternatives. So that's what we see as the solution, giving people that power to replace the racist policies, institutions, and the culture, and instead seeing it as a collective commitment toward co-liberation. And that collective commitment component really, I think, embodies also what Asandi was talking about, where we have multiracial and multi-generational, a network that is that. So our fellows are coming from all different backgrounds, and it's about learning what is our personal responsibility to address structural racism and developing that collective commitment toward co-liberation. And that's such a big theme in the fellowship program. And so our racial equity definition really, I think, embodies a lot of the overarching themes and the lessons, principles, the values that we share in the fellowship space.
Thank you, Aisha. Now, Namira will talk about the Racial Equity Fellowship, like what it is, what we do, our curriculum. She'll also share some of the experiences and observations that some fellows have had during this fellowship experience, during their fellowship experience.
Thanks, Asani. So together, I was part of Deal 3. So we are currently in Deal 8. So there have been 8 cohorts since 2014. So this year is actually the 10th anniversary of Deal. But what does the fellowship actually do? We bring together both emerging and experienced leaders in arts and media, community development, education, environment, food security, healthcare, housing, and other sectors that are throughout the city. And those who are having a deep commitment to racial equity. And so the program itself is free. It is a 12-month program. And we really think about it as a leadership development fellowship. So sometimes folks start out with one organization and then they end up moving to different organization. We're really equipping folks with what they need for their own personal leadership growth, regardless of where they're at. It is multiracial. We are also multi-generational. So especially as you notice the emerging and experienced leaders, that is part of that process. So we have a few learning objectives, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we do this. But one is to build structural racism analysis. So we really want to make sure people have different frameworks, tools, ways to understand and talk about structural racism. We are also very much place-based. So we work to deepen understanding of structural racism in Detroit and really talking about Detroit's history in this work. We work to understand one's own racial and racialized identity. So we spend some time in session even talking about that difference, right? Racial versus racialized identity. We explore and practice with multiracial coalitions. We also explore how white supremacy culture shows up for all racial groups. So really going back to what Aisha was mentioning about collaboration, really thinking about how these coalitions are forming, working together, and how this white supremacy culture shows up differently for different groups. And finally, we move from allyship to collaboration. And so we cite a few folks, but one of the leading kind of scholars on that is Tawana Petty. And so really, how are we thinking about that? Like both understanding allyship, but then also moving from that to collaboration as well.
And Aisha, Tawana was deal 3 or 2?
No,
Deal
was
two.
Deal 2.
Deal 2
Yep.
fellow. Okay.
So 3 of the ways that we are really thinking about this, relationships are core. And so Mama Lila Cabell was somebody who was just instrumental in starting the program and influenced the program. A lot of us were very honored to be able to spend time with her throughout the Deal Fellowship program. And so relationships, Mama Lila always used to say that relationships are built at the speed of trust and that movements are built at the speed of relationships. So Deal especially is a space that is very much focused on relationship building. So we co-create a space, which is why it's so important for all of you as well in the space. We co-create a space to deepen relationships within that multiracial and multi-generational network. We develop that shared understanding. So making sure that we are all talking with each other and having that shared understanding of structural racism and how it plays out in Detroit, and then moving toward collective action. So we work together to define a vision for moving Detroit toward racial equity. What is it actually, right? Instead of what it's not. And so here's a quote from Brianna Chester Bay. Our fellows are people who are on the ground, who have been working on the issues, and who have creative solutions. Together, we move toward thinking about collaboration and multiracial coalition building and what collective action looks like. The intention is that fellows can rely on each other as collaborators in the work that they're doing. So our curriculum arc, right? Where do we go in 12 months together? We start out with this piece around identity, right? So really grounding in politicized and racialized identity. So we spend a lot of time, especially at the beginning of the fellowship, talking about our personal, but then also our ancestral connections to liberation. So really, having these moments to be grounding in who we are, but then thinking about identity in multiple layers and multiple spaces as well. From there, we move into this understanding and analysis of the structure. So we talk and explore white supremacy culture. We talk about structural racism. We dive into really understanding anti-Black racism and having that in the second part of the arc. And then as we move into the last part of the arc, we move into this piece around the collaboration and social change ecosystem frameworks. So what are our gifts and our roles in creating change? And then here's a quote from Shane. So Shane says, to address things like structural racism and other systems of oppression, we have to look at our own personal journeys around healing because we can only go as deep as we are willing to go ourselves. So the fellowship strikes a balance between the collective work that we're doing together and the personal work that we need to do around healing. And then this piece around impact, we are shifting our fellows' baseline understanding of racial equity and supporting their journey toward collaboration. So through the program, our fellows can discover more about themselves, Detroit, and the deep history of structural racism, while reflecting on leadership and the power that comes from close collaboration. I think, Asanya, I'm handing it back to you.
Yep. I want to, excuse me. Thank you, Namira. I want to add there, as I want to be really explicit that we are intentionally using the language racial equity and not diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or justice, equity, all of the acronyms that do not include racial equity. We are very intentional about this. So if you are here and watching this and joining us live and in person, and your perception was that this was a DEI training opportunity, this is not what DEAL is. We are racial equity, a racial equity leadership development program. We are not DEI, and we unapologetically center anti-Black racism in our work, acknowledging that we are in Black Detroit. So I want to be really clear about that so that as you enter this application process, that you just have that clarity. We want to make sure that if you join the fellowship and join us in January, that you don't show up with a DEI expectation, because that is not what this is. And if you have questions about that, we certainly can talk more about that as we wrap up this presentation. Oh, there's one more quote from Ree. We are building the capacity of people to act. We want to have a network. You hear that? You will hear that word a few more times, of people all throughout the city that know how to take action on equity issues. The lab is where you stir things up. Start to ask questions and do the experiments, so that when you go back to your organization and back into your neighborhoods, you can engage in actions that promote racial equity. We are not just talking about it, we are pouring into and learning from and with, so that we all can take action. So the photo you just saw was of Rihanna. We call her Ree, and she is the actual fellowship program manager. So she is really leading the fellowship, and is the point person for implementing the curriculum and the sessions that are facilitated by the design team. In her absence, as we are right now, as I said, she is on maternity leave. Then that I become the lead as the director of deal. So in addition to having Ree and the design team that participate, that really are leading the fellowship, the facilitation, we occasionally will invite guest presenters in. Namira talked about and uplifted Tawana Petty's name as someone who we regard as one of her expertise being collaboration. And so we invite her to come and talk to our fellows about the co-liberation lens that she has. And we will do that throughout the fellowship when it makes sense, and when it is appropriate, and when guests are available. And we often will tap our network of fellows and their expertise, and invite them to come back and share as it makes sense around the curriculum. Some of the frequently asked questions that we get, these are some of these questions are also on the website, so you can feel free to visit the website page with the Deal 9 application to revisit these, or listen to this recording again. Folks often want to know, like, who can apply for the fellowship, who's eligible, what determines a good fit, what are the fellowship commitments, where and when does the fellowship take place, and how they or their organization can support the fellowship. So I'm going to answer all of those questions for you. And if you have questions beyond that, we can certainly take time and talk about those. You've heard us talk about emerging and experienced racial equity leaders. To dive a little bit more deeply into that, we have fellows who have been, and since I've been with Deal, in their early 20s. In this current cohort, we started with a fellow, an elder who was 81. So when we say emerging in experience and multi-generational and multiracial, we mean it. As if you are 18 and older, you are eligible for this fellowship. If you live or work in Detroit or the metropolitan area, and to say more about that, your work needs to touch. Even if you work statewide or you work regionally, your work in some way has to touch and impact the city of Detroit. But if you're 18 and over and your work touches Detroit and you deem yourself as a racial equity leader, then this is a fellowship opportunity for you. You do not have to be an employee of an organization. You can be an individual activist or volunteer who is doing work in the city. You don't have to have an organizational affiliation. And again, you can be a volunteer, you can be an employee, you can be an individual. It does not matter. We want to make this as accessible as possible. So those barriers that you have to have an affiliation are removed there. And again, 18 and older, your work is impacting Detroit. We want you to apply. Who's a good fit? We spent some time a couple of years ago thinking about the characteristics and qualities of like ideal fellows. Fellows that show up with these characteristics and qualities tend to do very well in the fellowship, but they also receive a lot of benefit from the experience and what they receive, but also just what they contribute. They have had a deep personal commitment to racial equity. They are critical thinkers. They are respectful and open to different perspectives. Because we are multi generational and multiracial, we are not a monolith. There are a ton of different ideas that folks show up with, and we welcome that, and we invite them to have dialogue around that and set the expectation that they will be heard and respected. We hope that fellows will also actively challenge the status quo and dominant narratives because much of that is rooted in white dominant culture, white supremacy culture. So we want you to be a critical thinker. We also want you to believe that you can positively influence racial equity in Detroit. You got to have hope or faith, or otherwise, like the this fellowship is not an opportunity or a space to come and complain. That is not what we do. As we referenced in one of the other slides, it is about development, and it is about development for the sake of action, for doing, because we are doers and we believe we're solution oriented. We also want you to come with somewhat of an understanding of what racial equity is. We don't expect you to come as experts, but you have some understanding of what racial equity is, and you have a desire to join this network of other racial equity leaders. And then finally, you must be willing to sit with discomfort. You will be uncomfortable, and that is okay. And we believe that that is a part of the journey to facilitate your growth as a leader and your learning. What are the fellowship commitments? You got to be present. Um, we'll talk a little bit about where and when the fellowship takes place, but you have to be present, so that it's not just being physically present, but being present with your time and attention and your energy. We want you to engage in reflection, to be not just self aware, but self assessing, and to take action for change. The fellowship, while we are, as a design team, we lead the fellowship and we are facilitating, we are co creating this culture of dialogue with you. I often say that while we have our own expertise as a design team and individual leaders, Deal is not leading this fellowship or implementing this fellowship from a place that we have all the answers. So we learn and grow along with the fellows. And in order to do that, it is a culture of dialogue that is shared. It is not just about us talking at fellows. It is really often, and most of the time, centering the fellows' voice. We want you to be willing to learn and open to learning and experimenting. Even though we have this curriculum that we are very proud of, there are things, I feel like every cohort we tweak and try something a little bit different and new, because we are often evolving and growing, and we want you to be doing the same. I mentioned the expertise that the design team has. We expect fellows to trust and respect our team's expertise. While I said again, we don't come with all the answers as a program or individuals, but we know what we know, and we lean into the expertise that we have, which has helped shape and inform the fellowship experience. We want you to share your expertise and your perspectives and your resources. This is a place where you can to bring that. Again, we are co-creating this fellowship experience. And we also want you to stay connected, not just during your fellowship experience, but after the fellowship when you become a part of the network. And we want you to continue to build relationships, not just in your cohort of Deal 9, but across the cohorts of fellows as well. Attendance is a big thing. So while this Fellowship is free, and we do not have the resources to compensate folks for their time. Attendance is required. If you are not there, not only do you miss the learning, but you miss sharing and you miss the opportunity to do the relationship building with your other fellows. So we have a policy where if you are absent more than 3 times, you will be dismissed from the program. We understand that life happens, which is why we account for and allow for the 3 absences. But this curriculum is intentional, thoughtful, and at times intense, and missing more than 3 sessions really impacts your ability to have had the full experience that we're offering. So 3 absences are allowed. More than that, an individual will be dismissed. And what that means and how that looks is navigated on a case by case basis. The first session for the fellowship starts in January of 2025. There's a 2-day orientation that is January 9th and 10th. That is in person and it is mandatory. It is not optional. So while I said you can miss 3 absences, that orientation is not an allowable absence. You have to be there for that. It is really important to set the context for what the next 11 months are going to be. There is also the expectation, which I believe is just a courtesy of if you are in the fellowship, if you are going to be late or that you're going to be absent, if you know it in advance, or if it's even the morning of, that you communicate that to Ree or myself, so we know. Like, while this is a professional environment, we care and center the individual. And so we want to know if you don't show up, we don't know if you're okay. We don't know. So extend us that courtesy of letting us know if you're going to be late or absent. But attendance is very, very important. And we do take attendance at every session. When and where does the fellowship take place? We have settled on a hybrid model. Um, as we said before, this is a 1 year, 12-month program. Monthly sessions take place on the second Thursday of every month. However, as you noted with the orientation that I just mentioned, there are the orientation and I believe 2 other sessions during the year that are 2 days, which would be a Thursday and a Friday. The calendar is already been set for 2025. So if you are invited to join the fellowship, you will receive those calendar dates far in advance so that you can plan accordingly. But this helps you to think about if you have any existing conflicts, the second Thursday of every month, and a couple of times throughout the year, there it is a 2-day session of Thursday and Friday. We also have optional sessions, and I want to emphasize optional. Those are virtual sessions, always virtual sessions, and we have 6 of those throughout the fellowship year. Those are on the fourth Thursday, with the exception of the one that is in November because of the holiday. It's on the third Thursday. And those optional sessions are scheduled from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. We rarely go to 3 p.m. We usually wrap up around 12 or 1, but you will also have on the calendar what those dates are as well. The fellowship is hybrid. We have been hybrid. This is our second fellowship that we've been hybrid. We were virtual during COVID, and that was difficult, as you can imagine. Zoom fatigue was so real. And so, what we've landed on is what we think is a good mix and rhythm for us and the fellows is this hybrid model. But most of the sessions, I believe it is 8 of the sessions, are all in person. And those in-person sessions are full days. We usually start at 8:30 with breakfast and then really kick off the fellowship programming at 9 a.m. and it lasts until 5 p.m. So again, take all of this into consideration as you think about submitting your application and what your capacity and commitment can be, what you really have the time to do. So the application, as you all know, the application opened on August 1st. It is a competitive process. We have a maximum capacity in the cohort of 30, but we have really found that anywhere between 20 to 25 fellows is really a sweet spot and what's best manageable for us. The application has 13 questions. The questions are character limited, so you will not be able to go on and on and on and on. We know you have great experiences and we look forward to getting to know you in the fellowship, but the application is not the space for that. So you really need to be thoughtful about and succinct with what you want to share and your responses. I want to say something about, particularly about this and about the wholehearted effort. The questions on this application, there are no correct specific answers that we are looking for. We really want, this is an opportunity for you to introduce yourself to us. We want to get to know who you are. We want you to give these application questions and your responses a wholehearted effort. We want you to be thoughtful and we want you to answer honestly. I'll talk a little bit more about what happens after you submit your application and who sees it, but know that the application itself is held in confidentiality. So there's a very small group of folks who will ever have access to it. So show up, show us who you are. You don't need to present a certain way. We're not a formal program, and the fellowship experience is not that as well. I want to, we have gotten this question a few times about racial equity work and what does that mean? And I want to clarify that as well as what we mean by racial equity leadership, because we've discovered that some folks get tripped up by that. So I'm going to read to you this definition that we have that is also in the fellowship application. We define racial equity work very broadly. We acknowledge that activism and movement work can look different for all of us. This work, like leadership, can occur out front, in the middle, and in the background. The deal values all types of racial equity work, seen and unseen. If you have meaningfully supported or participated in ending structural racism in any way, you have done racial equity work. For example, it is more than protesting or a job title. It is also providing nourishment for the protesters. So if you think about the folks who, the march on Washington, or you think about the Selma Bridge, and you think about there were folks and the voting, the attempts to register Black folks to vote. There were folks who were making sure those folks were nourished. They were doing racial equity work. We may not know their names, but that's also a part. We consider that also a part of racial equity work. So again, the seen and unseen. There are multiple ways to do this work and to honor and respect your capacity, time, energy, and other resources, which is why we stress that it is more than being on the front lines. Please do not downplay your experiences. This application is an opportunity for you to revisit the work that you've done and for you to share it with us. So I hope that that is helpful as you consider applying for the fellowship. And then I want to read to you how we think about racial equity leadership and what we mean by that, because I think that will also be helpful as you think about your responses to these questions. We've talked about welcoming, emerging, and for that, for us, that can mean like you can be new, you can be early in your career or a new volunteer and rising throughout either your organization or learning and growing in your work. Or you can be an experienced leader that may have decades of work in the game. That's fine. Your application your application is based on the review of it will be based on your responses rather than your years of experience. So if you only have a few years of experience, that is okay. Do not talk yourself out of applying. It doesn't matter if you have 2 or 3 years or 25. It does not matter. We welcome all levels of experience. Leadership for us is not just a title, and it can be formal and informal. It can be a part of your work, as I've said before, or it can be your volunteerism. Racial equity leadership, like racial equity work, is not singular. It does not look one particular way. How you lead is unique to you, and we want to know that. It looks different across organizations and people. You are a leader if you have led all or a part of a project, process, program, or initiative, either from the front, the middle, or behind. So, the questions that we ask on this application really are intended to help us understand the kind of leader that you are and who you aspire to be. The process, the selection process. So we have an application jury that includes the deal staff and also alumni. And there's about eight of us that review applications, and we have an evaluation criteria that we evaluate responses to 5 specific weighted questions, as well as look at the overall application. So those scores are considered in determining who advances and who is invited to join the fellowship. I want to reiterate again that we value both professional or career employment experience as well as volunteerism. And while we have the application jury, the deal staff makes the final decision of who is invited to join the fellowship. And we use that evaluation criteria to help us do that. What happens next, if you're wondering, is the application will close on September 30th at 11:59 p.m. I encourage you not to wait till 10 o'clock at night to submit yours, but you have until 11:59 p.m. to submit that application. We will promptly begin to start to review those applications, and will notify applicants on November 15th whether they have been invited to join the Deal 9 cohort or if we have declined their application. A reminder that the fellowship orientation that is mandatory will be on January 9th and 10th, and it is both days and it is all day, 8:30 to 5 p.m. for both days. We will culminate the fellowship. I know it may sound like strange to talk about December 2025, but we want you to know the beginning date and the end date. So the graduation or fellowship celebration will be December 11th, 2025, and that happens in the evening. And it'll be really great. We'll have great food and music. So that's what you have to look forward to. And I'll stop there. I'm going to stop sharing and find out if there are any questions that anyone has. Feel free to place them in the chat, or you can unmute and ask us any questions that you may have. And if we've answered all your questions, that's cool too. I also want to invite Aisha, Namira, and Peter, if there's anything that you want to add to or say that maybe or elaborate on that I mentioned or missed, feel free to do so.
I can see one thing about like the discomfort piece. I think people sometimes you hear like race equity and you think like, oh, discomfort's going to be from like being held accountable and called in. And it's not that we don't do that, but at the same time, the discomfort often comes from the like deeply personal, we call it homework sometimes, but it's really people have redubbed it as soul work. And so really there's like a deep reflection, commitment, analysis of just like your lineage, your ancestors, migration stories, right? Like all the stuff that has brought you to this moment. And so that type of discomfort is a little bit different. It can feel very there's a sense of vulnerability. It can feel exposed, right? Or it can just be like, whew, I'm looking at things slightly differently. This is unpacking things that I had a different perspective toward. So that discomfort, I just wanted to name that. The other thing with like co-creating space, we do that with a lot of storytelling. So if you are someone we'll often will prompt to just be like, okay, we're gonna sit and do the storytelling, we'll take some breaks, but we do sit and really lean into a lot of our different ancestral traditions around like storytelling in a circle, right? Hearing from each of the fellows on some of the different prompts or things that we're talking about. So a little bit more about just like the day-to-day experience of it.
Thank you, Namira.
May I ask a question?
Of course, please.
Um, so I guess this is something that I need a little bit more clarification on. When you say years in experience, either some or many, in racial equity, uh, specifically, what type of positions are you referring to, or are you not referring to any specific type of?
I am not referring to any particular position. So we really want you to, as the applicant, to reflect on and assess the work that you have done and make the decision and determination if you feel that that is racial equity work. The title for us doesn't matter because many folks can have a title that is meaningless.
Right.
So really, if you feel like the work, because the questions are asking you about the work that you've done, some of the questions are, and who you are as a leader. So the title is really, I don't even believe that we may ask you your title, but it is not a consideration at all. It is really about the work that you have done. And if you deem that that is racial equity work, then we trust you as the expert of your own lived experience to make that decision and share that with us in the application. It really does not matter. What is more important to us is your understanding of racial equity, not the years of experience that you have
Okay.
doing the work.
Okay. Thank you.
Is
Yes,
that
that's the reassurance that I needed. Thank you.
okay? Yeah, trust and trust as you all look at the application. I encourage you to trust your instinct. Trust your instinct. Trust if something is like, oh, I think I should share this, share it. We encourage you
Right.
to do that.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate this.
You're welcome.
The other thing I can add is like just just thinking about like the context of applications, like this is not that type of application. I wanted to name that. Like, we're so used to like applications that are like, what is your transcript? What is this letter of reference? Like it's a very like, in the box, like prove who you are, like all this stuff, but tied to like metrics and titles and
Right.
clout. And it's not
Right.
that, right? Like we really are wanting to get to know you as a person, your perspectives, your thinking, lived experience, especially for those who are, Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, like your day-to-day lived experience of like resiliency and just doing community work is racial equity work, right? And so really grounding in that as well, that it's, we've seen this happen before with people during the application where they're like, okay, what do they want to hear? Let me type that. And then it's like,
Right.
that's not what the ask is for sure. And we want to make sure that we're kind of disrupting the typical way that applications are considered. And so part of this, like definitely please lean into what you are doing and not from a kind of like what are the metrics or what are the specific kind of like very white supremacy heavy ways of understanding the work.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That's very important because essentially that's exactly how I look into the application process is that it has to be formal. It has to be, what do they want to hear? And more times they don't really value anecdotal evidence or your
Right,
perception.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
So
thank you so
thanks.
much. Thank you so much for making that clear.
Thank you for the question.
Of course.
I have a
Other,
quick question. Oh,
yes.
thank you for this presentation. It's been really, really helpful. And I guess just, is there kind of, what do the in-person sessions look like? Are there some examples of kind of, I'm sure that they're all different and, but just kind of any idea you can give of kind of what types of learning experiences, sharing experiences there are.
Namira, I'm gonna have you answer that, but before you do, Jessica, if you are on social media, I invite you to check out Deal's Facebook page because
Oh, okay.
this is rare. This was a rare peak because we hold the fellowship space sacred, and we are for real about that.
Mhm.
But last week we had a session, and there are some videos clips on Deal's Facebook page from that session last week that you'll get to get a glimpse of what happens, at least what happened in that session or part of that session.
Okay.
So check that out.
Thank you. I'll check it out.
But Namira can share more.
Yeah, I was actually just about to say that. Like, for example, for our last session, well, we do have like a formula that we like to follow for our sessions that it just over the years, especially being hybrid, doing stuff on Zoom, doing stuff in person, that we've kind of landed. And so your typical session, it's like you'll come in, we will do some like grounding in different things, right? Whether it's land acknowledgements, ancestor acknowledgements, that kind of work. And then we usually have some kind of opening circle, prompt or question. And then there's some either a homework share out or some kind of share or analysis building or some kind of learning objective that is in the morning, like before we go to lunch. So last week, for example, one of the prompts, and I think this is a really valuable set of like videos or things to see, because the prompt was to use symbols or a metaphor to talk about their journey from when they started Deal to where they are right now to where they would like to go in the future. So we give people time to explore a metaphor, right? And then to share out with the whole group. We usually take a nice, like, solid break for lunch. One of the things we offer is like people can hang out with each other and talk about the work or just hang out, or you can go off and do your own thing, right? If you need some time. And then after lunch, we usually have at least like we try to break it down by like one big learning block before and after lunch. Sometimes we'll have a couple different concepts or things, but we really like to have a mix of like a framework and then time to apply it, practice with it, and then do something else. But throughout the year with that curriculum arc, we do shift up like session to session for sure. So yeah, you're right about like different sessions feeling different. Right now, for example, Deal A is in the midst of caucus work. So we do break groups into, caucuses based on identity. And so we give them space to do caucus presentation work, right? As part of their last session. So there's yeah, it changes from session to session, but we really like having a mix of like learning, storytelling, whole group engagement, small group work, right? And then coming back to talk as a large group.
Great. Very helpful. Thanks so much.
You're
I have a
welcome.
question.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is James. This is really good information. I stay on the east side of Detroit, and one of the reasons I'm interested in this is I'm doing some work, some beginning work with Grosse Pointe. Should I include that in my application? That's only a small part of the racial work I do. I'm a Black nationalist. I can go into all of that, but should I include that in the application? Or should I just talk about my general experience?
You can share, yes, of course. If you feel like yes, the short answer is yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All
Yes.
right.
Please.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I'm going to respond. Oh, thank you, Namira. I was going to respond to the question that Hazel had about are the second Thursday sessions in person or virtual. They're hybrid, but most of the sessions, like I believe 8 of them, if my count was accurate, are in person. And 4 of them are virtual. But again, that would be if you are invited to participate in the fellowship and before you accept the invitation, you would get the calendar with the invitation. So you will know those dates in advance and can make a decision before you say yes or decline about your availability and capacity. But 8 of those sessions, I'm pretty sure, are in person.
Also, when we say hybrid, it doesn't mean that like some people are in person, some people are virtual.
Thank you.
So,
I'm sorry. I forgot about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
thank
if
you
we
for
are in
clarifying
person, it's
that.
like everyone is in person. If we're virtual, everyone is virtual. So yeah, each month it just all like changes it up throughout the time.
Thank you for that, Namira. That's a good point that we need to clarify moving forward. Any other questions? Thank you so much.
I wanted to say something real quick. Just
Yes.
I put in the chat just a few messages back, some links that people might find helpful. There's the link to our website. So everything that we talked about is shared in some form on the website, and we even go into a little bit more detail there. Also, we have been collecting impact stories from fellows who have graduated from our program. And so I dropped the link to a video of our Deal 3 alum, Mark Crane, if you want to hear about his fellowship experience. And then I also linked our social media pages where you can see glimpses into the program, some of the things we've done. The session that Namira was just talking about, it's one of our recent posts on our Facebook page. So yeah, all those links are there.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you all. It's 12:59. We also strive to be respectful of time. Thank you so very much for taking time to spend part of your afternoon with us, and also your interest in DEAL. The email address DEAL, DEAL @wayne.edu. If you have questions throughout the application process, we do check it Monday through Friday and give us 24 hours to respond. Have a lovely afternoon and a great day. And thank you for the work that you are doing in your respective communities and organizations. And we look forward to reviewing your application.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having me.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you all so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.